This week, we are talking about imposter syndrome. It's an internalized, persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. Realizing that a lot of people in academia feel this way can help you realize that perhaps it's not you. It's partially the system that we're all operating in that is a little bit designed to make us feel this way. We're going to talk about what is imposter syndrome and why you need to have a name for this feeling, this sort of crushing, torturous self-doubt that can be with you like a gremlin. Because if we don't talk about it and it's just there, then you might think, oh, that's just how it is. This is normal to feel this way. It's good to talk about it. It's good to realize that, oh, a lot of people feel this way. And actually very successful people, not only in academia, feel this way. We're going to just, course hack imposter syndrome to try and pull away its power. This is Course Hacks for Higher Ed. Okay, everybody, welcome back to Course Hacks for Higher Ed. We have with us today, as always, Dr. Brian Dewsbury, Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Rhode Island, and Assistant Dean Michelle Fonts from the College of the Environment of Life Sciences. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us and talking about our topic of the day, imposter syndrome. And I'm sure we've all felt it at some point. I want to kick it over to Brian to talk about imposter syndrome, just to maybe give us a little background on like what it is and, whether or not, have you felt imposter syndrome before? And I'm not implying that you should, I'm just asking the question. And, what advice you have for students. I mean, I think especially grad students suffer from imposter syndrome, maybe even more than undergrads. So what advice you give and how to combat it?
Yeah, for a second there, I thought you asked me to leave the call. You're an imposter. Get out. We the real professor here. Is that imposter syndrome written on the board behind you?
Yes.
I think I have to ask. Were you like model that? Is that what's that?
Well, I'm impressed with myself because the video's mirrored, so I had to write it backwards.
Oh wow!
To get it to show up right.
I'm impressed.
You see it backwards too.
Oh, it shows up backwards for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe, you know what, do not cut this segment. I want our audience to see exactly what goes into projects, okay? You. Well, now, it's a good question to start off. And, I think this is a topic we could talk about for a while. But I think it's a really important topic because even though you say that grad students and maybe even professors or professionals feel it more than undergraduates, I think undergraduates begin to feel it. Mm-hmm. We tend to call it something different in the literature. We call it social belonging. We call it STEM identity. But it actually all harks back to a very similar premise where you enter a space and you interpret or you deduce that to be in that space, to be accepted as one of the members of the in-group in that space, there are certain behaviors that are expected. There are certain, intelligence levels, so to speak. In some cases, even certain ethnicities you might, expect to be accepted. And so the more you fall out of that Venn diagram, the more you perceive that you don't possess the traits that you think are the norm for that, then the feelings of imposters, starts kicking up, right? Now, I think there's some good and some bad news here. I'll start with the bad news first. The bad news is that I don't think that it ever fully goes away. But that actually, to me, is not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of times when we discuss imposter syndrome, you put the burden on the person who's feeling the syndrome as having to figure out a way how to get over it. When, as you know, and you know from my work and the kinds of talks that I give, I say I put it on the system to create an environment so people don't walk in and feel like they're imposters, right? Yeah. So when the three of us were coming through the ranks and coming through school and coming through grad school, we had to look around our environment and say, okay, I see what's going on here. I see how I feel, but you know what? I'm going to make it regardless, right? I am still going to be Nell. I'm still going to be Michelle. I'm still going to be Brian, right? Judge me by my work. And the good news I get, to that other piece is that the way I think you address that is to really actually take a few steps back and ask yourself what it is you love about what you do, what it is, what kind of impact and good you're trying to create in the world, and keep your focus on that moral mission, regardless of how other people have chosen to do that pathway, right? So even if their pathway is different to yours, it doesn't invalidate your way of being, right? Even though you may speak and say things differently or dress differently or want to do something different with this discipline, it doesn't invalidate that in any way, but that's a process. I am almost 41 and it took me years, even into faculty life, to really get to a space where I was truly comfortable with defining my work and my profession, my teaching, my research in a way that was uniquely me. So
Mm,
I'll leave it there.
I
I know
So
love that.
Brian,
what
Can
I
I
think.
show this sign? Can you guys read this sign?
yes,
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
well,
yeah.
you could see it.
Okay, because I can't, so that means you can. Okay, I'm
Okay.
starting to figure this out.
So Brian, I just want to ask you a question after you describe that. Can
Mhm.
you, because I think it'll be helpful for students, can you give an example when you experienced it? Because I want to give an example to students of kind of when you walk into a space and how you feel like you're experiencing imposter syndrome. Do you remember an example of that just so that students know? And I'll also do the same.
Yeah, I'll actually give you two quick examples. One is an extreme example because unfortunately this still happens from time to time to students of color. I went to an academic society meeting, pretty famous one. I won't name it, but when I was actually went as a grad student to present a poster of my research. And for the undergrads who don't know what I mean by that, we conduct experiments, we get results, we hopefully find something useful. And you go to big meetings of 4 to 5,000 people and you discuss your findings, discuss your project. And 2 years in a row at this same conference, people who attended the conference, mostly white, approached me and asked me to bring milk from the back of the convention center, right? So that they kind of mistook me for the coffee staff, for the convention working class. And so of course, obviously, I know I'm not part of the staff, but when you get sort of immediately categorized like that, it does trigger some really feelings of like, will people really ever actually fully accept you? Now, I feel grateful that I'm built in a way that, well, that's on you. I don't, I can kind of shrug that off and move on. Not everybody can. The other perhaps lighter example, this actually comes from grad school as well. This is more unintentional, right? I studied marine ecology. I really thoroughly loved it. My work style has always been get the work done. Um, be driven by outcomes of the work. It needs to get done, and how it gets done is something that I have to carefully plan, right? So I've never been because I'm a grad student, I have to be working 90 hours a week, right? That to me doesn't make any sense. Like the amount of time you spend working shouldn't necessarily correlate to the label. Like what should correlate to the label is the amount of time the project needs. So because of that, I made sure I had kind of another life outside of grad school, but that wasn't the culture, right? There was a culture of to be a serious student, you must be in on weekends. And
Hmm.
what happens is when you look around and everybody else, is bragging about how they've been up till 2, 3 a.m. doing blah, 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 you could kind of sort of feel that people don't take you seriously as a scholar, as a growing scholar. Um, and you will find yourself in spaces where that could happen. And you have to remind yourself, again, judge yourself by your outcomes, right? So if you are getting the work done, regardless of what the scenario is, then that's what matters. If they choose to succumb to that persona, that's on them. So I mean there are more, but I'll leave you with those two.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting because, that term I think can be confusing, right? Because when I think about imposter syndrome, I think it's brought upon people and they end up feeling it, right?
Like
I don't think
gaslit.
it's something that you just walk in with, right? I think something happens for me. It was having to be the representative of everyone that's my color, right? Um, and it makes you feel some type of way when you're in that space, because there's an expectation that you're there to teach others, especially if it's predominantly a white community, about everyone that looks different like you, right? I think it's really good. It's a good thing that we brought this up as a topic, because I want students to know that a lot of times when you feel like not worthy of, or not respected in the same way others are, is to understand that it's really not about the student, unless the student's doing some things that they aren't, that they aren't supposed to or are supposed to, right? That's a whole nother burden. But don't feel like when you feel that way, it is something that you've done and you have to measure up to. It's really about the other people that, and it's unfortunate, because I think undergrads and grads really feel like they don't have the wherewithal or the confidence to stand up for themselves. And that's what worries me. And that's why I always go back to find someone to talk to if you're feeling some type of way when it comes to feeling like you're not worthy of, or feel like you're not good enough. You need mentorship to help you through that. Because if you sit in it by yourself, you fester and it gets worse and worse. And so, when I think about imposter syndrome, I think about that as a real burden for people. And I know you said, now, you think grad students feel it. I got to tell you, I think all of us right here on this call have all had moments where we felt that deeply. And I think the more you mature, you recognize it more. You're more conscious of it. And it can be more disturbing at that point. You're like, wait a minute, right?
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, Brian, it doesn't really go away, right? What I think you end up having to learn is you acclimate to the degree you can, but you be yourself at all times. And that is hard for our undergrads to understand. So I think it's unconscious. I think it comes in steps. Yeah.
Almost like you need a sign in front of you to remind you.
For real, more people to tell you, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I love my job, because I'm able to do that for the students I work with. Brian's able, and I'm sure you are too now. I think it's a responsibility if we're going to be serving students in any way, because they don't get it from everyone. We know that, right? Is to do the best we can to let them know that, wait a minute, you're worthy. You can't put that upon yourself. This is hard enough to do. Don't put the stereotypical stuff on your shoulders as well, and feel like you have to acclimate to this particular environment. But I do think it's a challenge, and I think it's hard. I think it's really hard.
I think you're right, Michelle. Were you going to say something, Brian?
I was going to say something quickly before you spoke, but perhaps I'll wait.
Well, I wanted to agree with you. So you're probably glad that I'm talking right now, because I'm agreeing with you. I think it's really important to have the words for it, recognizing that imposter syndrome is a thing. But it's also, I think, needs to mature as a concept, because especially for marginalized groups, students of color, it's not a syndrome that you're experiencing. You're actually very rational for recognizing that other people around you are delegitimizing your presence. And so that's something that I've experienced so many times. And you asked us to bring up a time. I mean, there was a time when I was working on my dissertation that I was out collecting data on a stink bug in a field, and I ran into another, researcher, and I happened to bring my husband along with me to help as a helper to carry heavy things. But that guy would not talk to me or look at me. He only spoke to my husband, who was like, actually, I'm just a dude and she's the researcher and the scientist. He still wouldn't talk to me. And those moments you're like, this isn't about me. So realizing that there's oppression that is not you, there's gaslighting that is not you, and externalizing and not. So when you say it gets easier as you get older, Michelle, I think you more and more recognize it's not you. It is the system that we're operating in.
And I don't know that I would say it doesn't get easier. It gets to the place where you recognize it and you don't internalize it as your thing. You put it back in the ownership on the people that are doing it, right? Because you've learned and you've gone through it. So yeah.
And in some ways it is harder to see it and recognize it and then just have to accept it. That's hard too. But not even knowing that it's the thing that was very hard too. Just thinking, oh, this is just how it is. And this is just how I feel. that was very hard. So when I learned the term imposter syndrome, I think I was like late in grad school, it was really helpful to even know, oh, some other people feel this way too.
And I think that's why it's important to have this topic today, because I think it's a valuable thing to help students get some language to help navigate how they might be feeling. For a lot of the students that we work with, one of the things that tends to drive or create this imposter syndrome type feeling is the first in ... right? So if you are first in college, or you come from a community where you don't see people who look like you, who are scientists or who are whatever profession it may be. So when you get into that space or that pathway where you're preparing yourself for that professional world, if you don't kind of have a frame of reference where that can tell you internally, like, yes, people like me do this and we do it well all the time, then you can be quick to tell yourself that you don't belong in this space because you don't have a frame of reference to go back to, right? And those are the students I think Michelle and I in particular always have to work with to really build up resilience, because the first bad quiz, the first stumbling block in that intro science class, it brings up this, oh, well, this wasn't for me anyway, right? And that statement just in and of itself really encapsulates what the imposter syndrome is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it behooves us as adults to understand what drives that. Is environments where being reminded of your firstness or your loneliness, right, can send really poor messages to you unintentionally or otherwise about who gets to do this or who doesn't get to do it, right? So I think you're right, Mel. Give it some language, sit and think about it, but recognize it for what it is. It's a syndrome, but it's we could, can put it to the side and get to the specifics. So just real quick, as how you deal with it. Yes, you need to recognize it, but you deal with it by focusing on the specifics, right? You got to.
Oh, I have tips there.
Right, you got to see in a quiz what happened with the preparation process specifically, not hard enough, not amount of time. What specifically happened with your approach? So you address this by looking at the specific behaviors and not like general, oh, I don't feel. Nell, what are your tips?
So yes, I think that's great to do. I mean, in the moment when you're feeling it though, it can almost be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that I've seen, that was recommended to me way back when was to work on my CV or my resume at those times. And basically, maybe you don't have a long CV, it doesn't really matter. The point is to work on anything like a list or anything that makes you feel and recognize your own value. So listing what are your positive traits, listing what are the things that you value in life, like your family or whatever it is. And for me, just that act of like, okay, well, I have to keep working. So I'm going to work on my resume and kind of pump myself up a little bit and focus on the things. Look, I actually can do this. I do have all of the same, I have the credentials, I have all of that, and focusing on the ways that you do, in fact, belong, and you don't need other people's permission to feel that you belong.
I would also say, one of the things that's pretty common with the students that I work with is, sometimes they struggle and feel like it's not for me, and I have to remind them, it's where did you go to high school? I went to Central High School in Providence. And so what unfortunately happens in some of our urban communities, high schools are totally different. So if you compare East Greenwich High School to Central High School, East Greenwich High School has all of the resources, has more advisors, has more people to help them through problems, right? In Central, they don't. They can be taking an AP bio class that looks very different than the one that's in East Greenwich. So then they get to URI, they're in Brian Dewsbury's class, and he's teaching everyone the same, and others are getting it, and you're not because you're not as prepared. That's an important thing to recognize as well, because it's really not about you. You did it.
And you may not have known that until that point.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Actually, Brian, you triggered imposter syndrome in me. You did. There was a workshop at URI where you did the kind of take a step forward, take a step back, the privilege walk.
Yeah, the amended privilege walk. But yeah, go on.
And I was like in a room full of, let's face it, mostly white, only mostly white professors and faculty, and we're all filling it out, and everyone at the table's like, and mine was like checked everywhere. And I was like, what just happened? I didn't realize that I was not as privileged as everyone else around me, and that was a moment for me.
Yeah, like
a moment I needed to have, but it was scary.
If a student, and it's hard for them, right? You're 17, 18, coming into a new environment, and some of them come in like, I took my AP classes, I'm good. And they just need more work than others. But all of a sudden, when you do comparison or you fail that first exam or quiz or something, you're like, oh, snap, I really don't know as much. Well, probably not, because if you went to Central or you went to Hope or you went to other schools, some of them don't have the same resources or wherewithal for you to know the stuff that you should know while you're.
Yeah. And I agree. I think when you realize how the odds are stacked and whether they're stacked in your favor or against you, it can be really jarring, but it can also be really freeing, because then you realize, oh, it's not me. It's
the system.
It's the system. So now it's about navigating that system and changing that system.
That's right.
When you have the power to do so.
And to use the resources that are at URI at that point, like when you have that recognition, and instead of feeling bad about the fact that you're not good enough, when that's not the case in most cases, right? It's all right. Okay, this is different. I need to find out who I need to talk to get better, and recognize that I just need to do more than others do because of their preparation. I've seen that happen for students through going to Academic Enhancement Center, going, to the TAs and things, and also getting help about studying with groups. And like it's something that you have to evolve in, and then getting some research in a lab. All of that stuff starts to get you to a place, but it's a struggle. And know that is not just your struggle. It is not about you. I think that's been huge when I've seen growth in students that recognize it.
Yeah, right. Like you get the idea that you need to be a solo artist. You don't need to be a solo artist in academia, right? You need to join a band.
Yes.
Awesome. Any last thoughts before we wrap up here?
I just want to give a shout out to Michelle, Airbnb Wi-Fi, for holding up.
Thank you, Wi-Fi. It's a great space that I'm in. I'm in Virginia, in Norfolk, Virginia. It's a very pretty place, but yeah, I'm just happy to be safe and sound here, isolated in my little Airbnb that I'm having internet issues with, but it'll be fine.
Well, I hope everybody stays safe. Next week is our last course hack for the semester, so tune in again next week. And thank you both so much.
All right, take good care.